Hey friends, Rod here with Zavivi Entertainment, and today I'm going through my video game collection. Don't forget to subscribe and click the thumbs up button. Let's get started. If you love retro video games like myself, you probably also have your favorite YouTubers you've watched over the years, and I'm no different. By just watching some of my videos, you can probably see where a lot of my inspiration comes from. I've been watching Angry Video Game Nerd since 2008 when his videos were on Screw Attack, and I've never stopped, and let's be honest, he's definitely worth watching. While I'm talking about my YouTube inspirations, I also want to mention Metal Jesus Rocks. I stumbled across him last year, and his videos are what finally gave me the push to start my own YouTube channel. Metal Jesus Rocks and his friends have made a huge impact on video game collecting, and if you've never watched them, I highly recommend it. Now back to why I originally mentioned James Rolfe, aka Angry Video Game Nerd. I've always been a big time gamer, and besides a few mishaps along the way, like selling off a bunch of games in 2001 to GameStop, or accidentally throwing away my Nintendo 64 boxes while moving, I've generally kept all my gaming stuff. I probably had less than 100 games before starting my collection, but to me it felt like a lot. And around 2008 I was generally only buying new games that interest me and only occasionally playing my old video game. Then along comes Angry Video Game Nerd, and his videos kickstarted a passion in me for retro video games that I still have today. This is when and why I started video game collecting. When I first started collecting, prices were much cheaper, and I bought a lot of my stuff from a store north of Nashville that had buy one get one free NES games, which is crazy to think about now. I also bought a lot of my stuff from McKay's, which I've mentioned in other videos. If I had known that prices were going to go through the roof, I would have bought a lot more stuff back then. At this point, I've been collecting for over 10 years, and I currently have around 2,270 video games, and that number is all physical copies. I'm not going to go into too much detail about specific games, and we'll pretty much be sticking to the amount of games I own for each system and share a couple stories here and there. So first up is Nintendo Virtual Boy. I own one game, it's Mario's Tennis. This one's a little sad because I actually owned this at one point in my life. I bought the Nintendo Virtual Boy when it originally came out, and it wasn't that great, but I did have a little bit of fun with it. However, I took it back and used the money on something else. I really wish I had kept it. I don't own the system, but it's definitely on my list of things to buy. Next up are my two NES reproduction carts that, believe it or not, I made myself. I bought everything I needed to do it, tried it on a couple games, and didn't care for it, and haven't done it since. Maybe I'll do a video in the future on the process, but for now I have these two games to show for it. Next up are two games for the Atari 7800 and two games for the ColecoVision. Sometimes I buy games I find just because they're cheap. However, I don't own either of these systems, and hopefully the games work because I haven't been able to test them. Next up is the Nintendo Switch. I have three games for this system. Zelda and Mario were awesome, and I have no regrets buying the system just to play these two games. I definitely can't wait for the new Metroid because I will most certainly be buying it. Next up is my Nintendo 3DS games. I own four of those. I don't play my handhelds very often, but I occasionally do buy some JRPGs for the handhelds and play them while traveling, which is kind of rare. And I bought the 3DS just to play Bravely Default, which was a pretty good game. A little repetitive at the end, but I still enjoyed it. Next up is my TurboGrafx 16. I own four games for this system. This came as a set that I bought off eBay. It's a fun system and I would love to collect more for it, but I have some other systems that I'm closer to finishing, and so I'm staying focused on those for now. Next is the Intellivision. I own 6 games for this system, but I don't own the system itself. Seems to be a trend with these older Atari-like systems, but I just don't own them. One day I'll pick them up for sure, but for now I own a few games for each of them. Next is the Wii U. I own 7 games for this system. I generally always buy the Nintendo consoles because the Mario and Donkey Kong games are so much fun to play. Next up is this strange console called VTech V-Smile. My mom was working at a Goodwill and this came through and they didn't want it and sent it home with her. I have 8 games for it, and the games are basically learning games for very young children. There's not much else to say about it. Next is the Super Famicom. I own 11 games for the system. I found the games at McKay's for very cheap, so I grabbed them. Nothing too special, and honestly I haven't even tried them because I'm reluctant to break the plastic pieces out of my Super Nintendo. Next is the Atari Lynx. I own 11 games for the system. This is another one where the games were super cheap, but I don't own the system. Next is the Game Boy Black cartridges. I own 13 games for it. You can find these games pretty cheap at different used video game stores, and I found all mine at McKay's. Next are PSP games. I own 14 of them. Again, I got them really cheap from McKay's, but I don't actually own a PSP. However, this is definitely a handheld I plan to pick up in the future because I heard they have some really good games for it. Next up is the GameCube. I own 16 games for this system. This system has an interesting story for me. Around the year 2001, I had put a flyer out in my apartment complex offering computer repair. An older lady in the complex had bought a GameCube to play and didn't really enjoy it, so she called me and wanted me to fix her computer and install some games, and paid me with the GameCube. It's one of my favorite consoles of all time, and I definitely plan to buy some more games for it. Next is the PlayStation 4. I own 18 games for this system. I bought this system just to play Bloodborne from Software. But I ended up getting the VR and have bought a bunch of additional games just for that. The VR is super fun and I highly recommend it. Next is the Sega Masters. I own 20 games for the system. Growing up as a Nintendo kid, I never heard of the Sega Master System until a few years ago. So I bought a console and a few games off eBay. Anytime I find games for the system, I pick them up because I love the boxes. Next is my Dreamcast. I own 26 games for this system. I actually bought this console the week it came out and had tons of fun with it. But I sold off most of the games during my 2001 sell-off, but thankfully I kept the console. I rebought a lot of the games I used to own and definitely plan to buy more. It's a great system. Next up is the Nintendo DS. I own 33 games for the system. I played through a lot of Dragon Quest games on the DS. Definitely one of Nintendo's better systems and probably my favorite handheld. Next is the Sega Game Gear. I own 35 games for the system. Again, another handheld where the games were super cheap at McKay's and I grab them anytime I can. I also bought a Game Gear off of eBay just to play some of the games on. Next is the Game Boy Color. I own 37 games for the system. Again, these are generally very cheap to pick up. My biggest issue with these handheld games is they don't display well at all. As you can see, they're just kind of sitting on my shelf and you can't even tell which games they are. Next is the Xbox One. I own 38 games for this system. I have all the new systems, but honestly I play the Xbox the most because of my achievement points. I had a lot of them when the Xbox One came out and I didn't really feel like losing them and switching to PlayStation 4 full time. So I stuck with the Xbox and honestly it hasn't really been that big of a deal. Next is Game Boy Advance. I own 39 games for the system. I even have some complete and box games which I picked up very cheap at McKay's. Next is the Game Boy. I own 42 games for the system. Most of these came from a plastic bin at McKay's for super cheap. Most of them were 99 cents to $1.99 a piece. Next is the original Xbox. I own 45 games for this system. I bought most of these last year. Sometimes I get focused on one system and forget that other systems have some cheap games. So once I realized it, I picked a bunch up. Next is my Atari 2600. I own 53 games for the system. Honestly, it's not my favorite system. I picked most of these games after trading in a bunch of DVDs to McKay's. These were like the handheld games and very cheap. Next is the Wii. I own 54 games for the system. I feel like this will be one of the more collectible systems from the last generation, so I try and pick up games anytime I can. Next is the PlayStation 2. I own 60 games for the system. I love this console and definitely plan to buy a lot more games for it. I'm a huge JRPG fan and those will be the games that I start with. Next is the PlayStation 3. I own 70 games for the system. I don't play this system a lot and originally bought it for Demon's Souls, which is a great game. I collected this many because buying pre-owned games at GameStop is very cheap. I definitely recommend taking advantage of it if you're trying to build a collection. Next up is the Sega Genesis. I own 124 games for this system. I always wanted a Sega Genesis growing up, and when I finally got one a few years ago, I went crazy collecting for it. Like the Sega Master System, I love the boxes. Definitely a console I'll be collecting a lot more games for going forward. Next up is the PlayStation 1. I own 160 games for this system. This might be one of my favorite consoles of all time. It has so many great games such as the Resident Evil series, most of Squaresoft's games, and tons of JRPGs. And I've only scratched the surface with my collection. Expect this number to go up big time going forward. Next up is the Nintendo 64. I own 163 games for the system. It's not even my favorite system, but I'm over halfway through collecting because there are only 314 games according to my collector's app. Definitely a system I plan to collect more for, and my goal is a complete collection. I think once I get an RGB or HDMI in Nintendo 64, I'll probably play it a bit more. Next up is the Super Nintendo. I own 188 games for the system, and I love it just as much as the PlayStation 1. It has so many great JRPGs such as Earthbound, Chrono Trigger, Final Fantasy games, Secret of Mana, Breath of Fire, and many more. I love buying the complete in-box games for the Super Nintendo. To me, they're Nintendo's best looking boxes. This is another system I'll definitely be collecting a lot more games for going forward. Next up is the Xbox 360. This may come as a surprise, but I own 380 games for this system. I've played a lot of the Xbox 360 and have beaten 95 games for it. The games are so cheap at GameStop that I find myself picking up anywhere from 5 to 15 games every time I would stop by. Well, last but definitely not least is my NES. This is my largest collection, sitting at 584 games. It also has my second most beat games with 68 of them. It is my most memorable system, and I really want to have a complete collection, minus the games that are a little too pricey. I would love to have the pricey games like Little Samson, but when I get to that point, I don't plan on stressing too much over those. Currently, my two most expensive games are DuckTales 2 and Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers 2. As a quick glance, I own a lot of Nintendo Powers and Game Informer magazines, which I haven't found a great way to display yet. Also, when you own a lot of game consoles, it comes with tons of accessories. And I keep mine in this closet and all these bins, which are very helpful. So that's a quick tour of my video game collection. I'm glad I was able to share it with you all, and I hope you enjoyed the video. If you have any questions, please feel free to post a comment below. As always, don't forget to subscribe because it really helps my channel grow, and click the thumbs up if you like the video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.